Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the hard way. I'm glad to have you along. What I mean with the hard way is that we are learning Vue.js by simply reading the documentation. We're reading through the official guide of Vue.js. So let's just jump straight into it. What we talked about last time, or let me put it this way, we are in the section of called template syntax. So we are reading about the template language of Vue.js, the syntax for that language, and how you can use it. And in the last section, in the last two videos, we talked about interpolation. So we've talked about the subsections text, raw HTML, attributes, and using JavaScript expressions. And the last thing we did was that we looked at JavaScript expressions. But so now we essentially know how to interpolate values into our HTML. Now the next thing that we're going to talk about here is directives. And like clearly these things overlap, because in order to talk about interpolations, we didn't just talk about the mustache syntax, we also talked about some directives, as we discussed in that video. But anyways, let's just see what they have to say about the directive section. Now we have two subsections here, arguments and modifiers. And yeah, I mean, let's jump into it and let's take it step by step, right? So directives, we already know, right? We know what they are. We know sort of how to use them generally, right? Like we know we can use directives if we want to bind some piece of our view to some property of our data model, which means that you can make a piece of the view be automatically updated whenever that underlying data actually changes, like this whole reactivity thing. Like you can use it as that kind of thing. You can use directives to bind something visually, but we can also use directives to, let's say, conditionally render something, which is what you see here, where they're using the directive v-if. But you can also use it to listen to events and run functions when those events are fired, like when different things happen, such as listening for clicks or like mouse clicks. So clicking on different buttons, for example, right? You can say, well, when this button is clicked, then I want to run this function. But you can also do things like listen to key presses or stuff like that. So but yeah, I think maybe this sentence is a good sentence, right? A directive's job is to reactively apply side effects to the DOM when the value of its expression changes. Actually, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, right? Because if yeah, I mean, because that's a very general way to talk about directives, right? Let me read it again. A directive's job is to reactively apply side effects to the DOM when the value of its expression changes. And that's actually true across all the scenarios that we talked about, right? So if you have an expression that listens to key presses, then that's the directive would react to that and then alter something in the DOM, and that depends on, I mean, it depends on what you've said that it should do. Sorry, I just got a bit confused now as to whether, like, do we have v on here as well? Yeah, okay, sorry, okay. I just wanted to make like 100% sure that they also call v on a directive. I was assuming that they call that a directive as well, and I think we've talked about that before, but I just wanted to avoid making a mistake. Okay, so that seems fine. Okay. So okay, back to the sentence, the directive's job. If you press a key, then you can react to that and possibly have a side effect in the DOM. If you use this if directive and listen to the value seen, then whenever the model property seen, whenever the value of that changes, then you will have a side effect in the DOM, which is that this particular element will either be visible or not visible. And so forth, right? I mean, the values are obvious when you bind to a model, right? Or when you bind something, right? When you bind to a, like using here, for example, using vbind, when you bind to some piece of data in your data model, then the attribute or whatever the thing is that you're binding, like let's say the href attribute of an a tag, or an A element, then that attribute, the value of that attribute will of course change whenever the underlying data model changes. So yeah, that's like, and that means that it's a side effect in the DOM. So I just think like that was actually like a very compact sentence that actually explains a whole lot if you think about what it says. A directive's job is to reactively apply side effects to the DOM when the value of its expression changes. But okay. So I think we're sort of all on the same page here. That makes sense. We know sort of the general point of directives. Let's jump further into the specifics, right? So then there's this section on arguments. And what they're saying then is that some directives can take an argument. And first, I didn't really read this section. I was just like, okay, I know arguments. That makes sense. What they're saying is that you vbind, and then you say equals, and then you pass some kind of property like an attribute in HTML. But that's not actually the point, right? Sorry about that. The point that they're making is that you can, notice this syntax here, right? They're saying vbind colon href equals URL. And the argument here, like in the sense of the title of this subsection, arguments, the argument here is the string href, or href, right? Maybe I should say href. Sorry, maybe that makes more sense. So the directive is vbind, and the argument to the directive vbind is href, and the value or rather the model property that we are binding to, or the expression that we are binding to, is URL, right? So that's actually what they're referring to. So they're saying that some directives, not all, right? Some directives can take arguments, which means that if there is something like vbind, or like the directive is vbind, but you can further specialize which kind of vbind you're talking about by passing this argument. And this we've explored in quite extensively, right? We've tried to vbind to foo, for example. So like whenever you say vbind and then you say put some argument here and then you bind to some model property, or actually put some expression, then whatever the argument here is, that will be rendered as an attribute on the element, or like on the opening tag of the element that this appears on, that this directive appears on. Because we tried, for example, in previous videos to do vbind colon foo equals blah, 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 something, right? And then we're actually changing the foo property of this element, even though there is obviously no such thing as a foo property, or a foo attribute, sorry, I should say, a foo attribute of the given element that we were trying this on. So you can bind essentially to anything, right? The argument here could be anything. But I guess that's not the case for example, I mean, I'm guessing now, right? It might be the case, but I'm guessing that it's not. I'm guessing that it's not the case for the second example, where you have an A tag or an A element, and on the opening tag of the A element, they also put, they put the V directive, they put the directive v on, right? Which is this listening to an event, and the event that they're listening to is the click event. And so click here is the argument to the v directive v on. So we're saying v dash on colon click, which means the directive is v on, and the argument is click. And then the model property that they are binding to, or it's not actually like that, right? It's the function in the model, or the method in the model that they are running, that will be run, like the event handler, I should say, right? The event handler that we are binding to is the method do something, right? So because they've put the string here called do something, and again, like as they were saying here, they're saying blah, 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 to the value of the expression URL. So here they're again emphasizing that it's not just that we're binding to a model property or a function existing in our sorry, I should say methods, because they called it the methods object. Again, like think about it like the data model and the methods object, and both of these things exist as objects on the V instance, right? Or on the configuration object that's being passed to the V instance. We've talked about this a lot of times, but at least in the first video. So yeah, they're emphasizing again that you can actually put expressions here, which is part of this using JavaScript expressions section that we talked about last time, and we explored that in quite some detail, where you can actually do pretty powerful things without actually expressing anything sort of explicitly in the model, but you can just sort of inline it in the template. Now, whether you should do that or not, that's a totally different question, right? Design-wise, maybe you shouldn't, but at least you can, right? So they're again here emphasizing that it's not like some magic where it's like, well, you just say URL and then it's like somehow you magically get this URL thing. No, it's rather that maybe you're in the context of this, and then they are exposing a variable URL, or like if your data model has a property called URL, then that's in scope when this particular piece of code is then evaluated, or when this particular expression is evaluated, right? Or the method do something and so forth, right? So they sort of put you in a scope where the things that you've made accessible in the model actually are accessible in the model. So these are actually expressions. Okay, but anyways, let's drop that. So I think that makes sense, right? It's like generally you can pass arguments to a bunch of different directives. We don't necessarily know which ones, right? So maybe we could actually figure this out. I mean, we've talked about the API reference a bunch of times. So let's go Google API reference Vue.js, and let's just see. Okay, so API reference. Let's see. I mean, arguments is a very general word to Google for, or sorry, to search for within a page, unfortunately. But let me just see if. Yeah, no, sorry. Of course, they're using arguments all over the place here. But let me do this. Maybe what if I search for click? Or maybe no, sorry. Actually, maybe yeah. Okay, no, but href is a bad example. Yeah. Yeah, not super good. Okay, we can probably find out a lot more about which arguments are available. No, wait. Am I being stupid now? vbind any argument or prop, attribute or prop. Yeah, actually, maybe that's what they're... Okay, wait. Sorry, I was being a bit stupid. Let's just quickly try to figure this out. Let's go from the top again. Argument. Here, arguments, object. No, but that's an argument that's being passed to a function. That's being passed to a function. That's being passed to a function. Directive. Yep. Actually, I think it was the only one where I mean, the only one that we actually found was the one where we found before. It's like I have to look at something. Yeah, this was pretty silly of me. Here, right? If we look at v-on, argument, event, no. Yes, no, yes, right? I mean, here, okay, so if we look at v-on, for example, then they're saying the argument that you can pass to v-on is an event. So then any event is an not an eligible, a valid argument to that, or to v-on. So then the question is just like, what are the lists of events that you can pass? But probably that's just native JavaScript. So if we would say, let's Google for JavaScript events, very short, very briefly, right? Let's see if we can find something here. So event reference. Yep. Sorry, let me just let the cat in. All right, most common categories. Yeah, research events, network events. I would assume, right? I would just guess that all of these events are actually, possibly, right? Probably depends on, I mean, it might be allowed, like it might be legal, but of course your actual element might not actually emit those kinds of events. But let's say, I mean, for example, focus here, I guess would work. Let's jump into the code that we've been using all of the time, right? So this is again same, or wait, set no wrap. This is again the same code that we've been looking at a bunch of times. So let's just, oops, wait, what am I doing? Whatever. Let's just open index.html and open that up in the browser so that we know what we are looking at. Like, this is the old stuff that we've been working with all the time. And then let's do something like, well, there was a focus event, right? So if we have this, let's say there's a p tag, yeah, there's a p tag that just says focus me, and then on the p tag we put a directive. Whoops, what is going on? Vim skills. Wait, is my keyboard sort of totally going crazy? No, I think a key is stuck. This is totally crazy. Hang on. Ah, okay, now we're not sure what happened. So let's say v on, so the directive v on, and then we're passing focus to that, which is an event, and then we want to call, let's actually say, let's just do something simple, right? So we'll put an expression here. So we'll just say fruit equals focused, right? I mean, this doesn't make any sense, but I just want to make sure that we have some kind of effect. So let's try that. Let's see if that works, right? And then let's go to our page, and then let's try that. So if I focus now on this text, nothing happens. So let me just check. Did we have any errors? No. Focus. V on focus. I guess, like, let me just change the click for once and then refresh and just see if that works. Yeah, so if I click that, then that works, right? So we know that the expression is doing whatever it's supposed to do, but focus seems to not be something that is yeah, you can't maybe use it that way. But maybe, I mean, does the p tag emit focus? I mean, I would assume that it does. So what if you have a button instead, right? No. Okay. So actually the p tag does not emit the event focused, but if you have a button, right? If you refresh here, and let me just tab through this page here. Let's see if when I tab to the button, the text orange will change for focused. Yeah, it does, right? So that's the way you use focused. So the event focus is for buttons, for example, or probably input fields or stuff like that. So yeah. I mean, so maybe a more sensible way of using this would be, let's say we have this input vmod, we have this input field, right? That models fruit, but maybe we could say v on focus, and then we'll just set fruit to empty string. Something like, I mean, this doesn't really make any sense, but at least it's a bit. So then this, when I click this input field, the text orange should be removed. Yeah, and it is, right? And notice how if I remove that, if we undo backwards and refresh, then now when I click it, it should not be removed. Yeah, and then it stays, right? So that seems to work. And I mean, obviously, this is like just because, what is that, like a black swan, right? The logic. We can't, from this piece of evidence, infer that all events actually work. Like, you can just take the whole event reference for JavaScript and then just assume that all of those events will be valid events to pass to v on. But I would assume, right? Like, if I implemented Vue, I would implement it that way. Like, that just makes a ton of sense. And I guess that's why they're saying that the argument is an event. So it's probably a JavaScript event. So, you know, I mean, that makes sense. It's like they would delegate to JavaScript to handle that, or they would simply pass they would set up the event listener. They would set up an event listener for that event in JavaScript. And the way you do that is probably by a string in JavaScript, right? Like, do we have add event? So, okay, one last Googling. Add event listener, I think it's called, right? In JavaScript. Let's see if we find, yeah, add event listener. I assume you pass a string here, right? Type a case sensitive string, right? So it would be somewhat trivial to just take this argument that you've written here, like now we wrote click for v on here, and then just turn that into string and pass that on to JavaScript and then listen to that. So I would assume that you can use any JavaScript event in this particular fashion. Of course, you have to put it in the right place and add a sensible handler for it, but at least like the basic plumbing is here for you. Okay, that seems pretty cool actually. So now we know about arguments in Vue and how you can pass arguments to directives. And again, some directives take arguments, not all. At least vOn and vbind take directives, and we know now both of them, right? Vbind takes any argument, like any string you want, because it just sets up, it just binds the attribute that has the name of that, the argument that you're passing, and the attribute does not have to be a default HTML attribute, it could be any attribute, and VON takes an event, and it seems like it's just a JavaScript event, so any JavaScript event you can pass on. Actually, I mean, probably it's valid just to put anything here. Instead of putting click, we could probably put like foo, but of course nothing is going to emit foo. But maybe you could actually, I mean, that's interesting. Now, I'm not going to Google for that because I'm too much on sidetracks, or I'm on too many sidetracks, but I guess you could even emit custom events in JavaScript, which means that it might even make sense to set up a listener to something arbitrary. And maybe you're even like using a third-party library that emits some quotation marks arbitrary event or some non-native JavaScript event. And so then you might actually listen to that. So pretty cool. That probably actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's now jump into modifiers. And let's look at this. So what are modifiers? So this was to me a bit surprising, right? Because I would assume that you would sort of do most things by, let's say, most alterations of like when you want to run a function, you would use filters, for example, to sort of pipe results through some form of chain of different transformations, like Unix pipes. But actually there are some odd cases where, like, for example, if you have an input field, you can force the input field to assume that everything you get is a number or something along these lines. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's something like that, right? What I mean is this, right? So modifiers here, modifiers are things that you can tack on to directives or to some directives after the argument. And what the modifier does depends on what the modifier is, right? So modifiers are not like you can just use any modifier. The modifiers are very specific. Like there are some specific modifiers. So here, for example, they're using the modifier prevent. So notice how, if I just read this out, they're saying v-on, the directive v-on, colon, so the argument is submit, like v-on submit dot prevent, right? And so the last part here, dot prevent, that's the modifier. And I think you can chain modifiers. So you could say dot prevent, dot something else, right? If you want all of those. But of course, if I'm not mistaken, these will happen in series. So it's important to think about the order in which you apply these modifiers. And what is prevent? I mean, prevent is if you come from I mean, if you've worked a bit with JavaScript before, you know what prevent default is. So prevent default is essentially that if you have a button and you have sort of a JavaScript, like let's say you have a submit button in a form. You have this form and then you have a submit button. And if you say prevent default, like if you say prevent default in your event handler, then you will force, or rather, maybe I should be even more specific. If you in your event handler, I mean, your event handler in plain JavaScript will get an argument called event, or it's not called event, but it will get an argument that you can call event. And if you call it event, let's say, then you can say dot prevent default, which they show here, right? And that's a way of telling JavaScript that I've handled this event on my own, right? I've handled this with my own event handler, and I don't want the browser to do the native thing that the browser does when this kind of thing happens, which might be, for example, if you have a form, to actually send a get or post request on the basis of, of course, a post request, like send an HTTP post request with the contents of that form. Now, if you're building a single page application, or like if you want to simply collect data from that form and stay on the same page without actually going off to a different URL, then you don't want the user to have to leave the page, right? You want to stay on the page, and you want your JavaScript function to deal with whatever happened in that click, or whatever is going to happen. Like, you want your event handler to be run, right? But your event handler can't be run if the user is leaving the page through this post request, right? By actually entering a different URL. So that's actually a very useful modifier, right? So whenever you have, so I mean here in our example, right, we have this button where we say v on click and then we say add fruit. Now we don't need to, but we could have said prevent here to do sort of a prevent default. So whenever I click this add button now, we won't be we won't do whatever the browser is intending to do natively with that button. But of course now it wasn't actually intending to do something. But if that button was part of a form, like an HTML form, and it's the submit button, then the browser would have wanted to do something, and by saying .prevent, we would have prevented the browser from doing that. And that's pretty cool, right? But so I have sort of mixed feelings about this because you have these modifiers, and for prevent, I just think that it makes a ton of sense intuit or spontaneously, because it feels like sort of this kind of ish special case. But then there are also a bunch of other modifiers. So let's actually, I mean, if we go to the API reference here again, and then we search for modifiers, let's see, I found a few before, right? So there are these for, yeah, so here are a bunch of modifiers for vbind. So you can bind to prop instead by giving the modifier prop. You can bind to camel, which, what, transform, not bind to camel, sorry, I'm reading and thinking. So you can add the modifier .camel, which transform the kebab case attribute name into camel case, right? So kebab case is this, when you're, I mean, think about this, right? I mean, it's like, let me jump over to the JavaScript, just, let me make a few comments. If you have snake case, it looks like this, snake case, let's say variable, for example, right? You're sort of delimiting words with underscore. If you, sorry, if you have camel case variable, then it looks like this, right? You're sort of using the first letter is a lowercase, and then you are uppercase whenever you have a new word. And if you have a kebab case variable, then you're delimiting words with ooh, sheesh, what is that called? Like, I know the Swedish word, but like a minus sign. Guys, what is it called? Anyways, this you know the symbol here. Anyways, okay, right. So okay, that was a quick aside, right? But those are just some conventions for variable naming. So so anyways, it seems like, I mean, you might so what? Transform the kebab case attribute name into camel case. Like, I'm not sure why you would want to do this. Like, what is up with that? So it's like, oh no, okay, sorry. So what the point of that is that you might want to have in your data model, you might want to have a property which is camel cased, like this, like a camel cased value. It's like foobar here. Or let's say we have selected fruit or something like that, right? Because if you did kebab case, that would not be valid JavaScript. Select, what did I say? Selected fruit, right? Like if you did this, I don't think that's a valid property name in JavaScript. Let's just try that. Let's just jump into Node, and let's say we have this object where you have foo pointing to bar, right? That's totally fine. But then if you have foo bar pointing to bar, yeah, unexpected token minus sign, right? So that's not valid JavaScript. So you might want to represent your property as in like with camel case syntax in your data model, but then you might want to have kebab case in HTML, because kebab case is actually pretty commonly used in HTML, as you can see, right? Because we have these v-4 dash, sorry, it's called dash, my mind. Oof. Okay, and then v-bind, right? So that's kebab case, right? As opposed to, like, it's not called vbind like this, and then item, and right? So yeah, I mean, that's another modifier, for example, and so forth and so forth, right? So there are 3 modifiers here for vbind. Then there are a bunch of modifiers here for vmodel, right? Lazy, number, and trim. And then let's see, and there are a bunch of modifiers for von, right? And yeah, I mean, let's not yeah, but like, so here, for example, only trigger handler for left button mouse events, only trigger handler for right button mouse events. All right, because you might be listening to mouse, but then you might say, well, only if it's left or right. And I don't know, I mean, I have sort of mixed feelings about this. It just feels like, yeah, I'm not trying to be rude or anything, right? I mean, it's like, clearly this is a very productive way, or like this is a very, you can just get on with, like, you just solve the problem and get on with your life. But it just feels like this should probably be like, these things could probably be handled in a more, let's say, idiomatic manner that sort of feels less hard coded towards a number of specific scenarios. But whatever, who am I to say, right? I mean, clearly I did not invent Vue, clearly. Anyways, let's move on. So those are the modifiers, and they're saying here also, like, if we go through this guide, you'll also see a bunch of other modifiers for VOn and VModel when we explore those features. And actually, I mean, we've just sneak peeked at them, but so probably those lists are the things that we'll go through. Now, okay, last thing for this video, and then we're gonna wrap it up. So shorthands, super cool thing, right? What they're realizing is that you'll use a bunch of V stuff all the time. And as I mentioned in another video, the point of this section is essentially that they're saying that if you're building an application where you actually have like mainly Vue.js, or like only Vue as a sort of a framework, right? Then it might make sense to just not use the long form directives, but use the shorthand directives, because you don't have to explicitly specify all the time that you're dealing with Vue, because the reader of your code already assumes that you'll be dealing with Vue, right? They expect to see sort of Vue directives, and they know what Vue are because they're working in a Vue application. Whereas, let's contrast that to a scenario where you are working on an application that is not mainly based around Vue, but is rather sort of mainly based on plain JavaScript or just some other framework like React or whatever. Then if you sort of sprinkle in a bit of Vue, then it might actually be very important to use the long form, the longhand. Can you say the longhand? Anyways, the long form directives, the long form syntax for the directives, because people might not necessarily, like, readers of your code might not actually be expecting to see Vue directives. So then you need to be very explicit that, okay, this is a Vue directive and not part of this other framework or whatever, right? I mean, I think that's actually a very good argument. I mean, they're making this argument here. So if you are if you're throwing in Vue in some place where Vue is not necessarily expected, just use the explicit sort of longhand representations. But if you're dealing with a full Vue app, then sure, just use these shorthands, because why would you want to clutter up your HTML when you're gonna with like saying vbind a bazillion times, because you're gonna bind like all the time, right? And you're gonna do like model all the time, or sorry, not model, but on all the time, right? And so forth. So I guess maybe for model as well. No. Maybe there is no shorthand for model, we'll see. But at least there are two shorthand syntaxes here, right? So you have a shorthand for vbind and you have a shorthand for von. The shorthand for vbind is that you completely remove the directive vbind and then just start with the argument. So there's colon and the argument, right? And that's a vbind directive. So when you say, so if you had v-bind colon href equals URL, then that's the long form, right? But if you want to do the short form, then you just say colon href equals URL. Much better, right? Because like you're gonna do that all the time. So let's just change that in our application, right? Let me just let's save this and make sure that our application actually works before I start to meddle around with it. Okay, so it works, right? So we have vbind here, and I should just say item then. Do we have any other vbinds? I don't think we have, right? Vbind, nope. And let me just jump over to main.js. Do we have any vbinds here? No, we only have, like in our template here, we only have this sort of mustache syntax. So let's jump back to index.html. Save that and let's run it. And it still seems to work, right? So that's totally fine. Okay, so that shorthand syntax works. Okay, then von. Okay, so you can shorten von by simply using an @ sign and also omitting the whole directive and then simply just specifying the argument. So it's like if the previous syntax was, or the long syntax is v-on colon click is equal to do something, then the shorthand syntax would be to remove the directive von and then just simply say @ click do something. So I think this is actually a pretty sensible choice. I mean, Colon is a bit arbitrary, but then you can just think about, like, if you want to use the shorthand form of vbind, just emit vbind, and then you're fine. But if you want to use the shorthand of von, then you can think about it as that, like, at. I mean, at, the word at is almost like when. So it's like, at a click, do something. If we read this sentence, right? I think that actually makes a lot of sense. It's like we're saying, at the event click, you should run do something. So that just, like, semantically, it seems like the at sign was actually a very good choice. So let's look. We have von here, and that's, I think, the only place. So let's remove the directive von, including the colon here, right? Because the colon, if we kept the colon, we would imply that that's it's a shorthand for vbind, but we actually want to do a shorthand for von now. Whoops. So like this, we'll just remove that, and we'll say at click dot prevent is equal to add fruit. We should also remove prevent. I just forgot to remove that before. So I've refreshed, I've saved. Let's see if that works. That still works, right? We can still add a bunch of stuff. Okay, let's also remove prevent now, because we don't actually need prevent here, because that modifier doesn't make any sense in our current application. Super good. This just works, right? Pretty cool, I would say. And those are the shorthands, right? And again, like, they're optional. You can use the full syntax if you want to, but really, why not do this, right? It's almost like, yep, that just feels great. It's almost like we can get into one line here, almost, right? It's just my font size is way too big. I mean, if I bring up the window like this, you can see that it's definitely good enough. And we could do it, whoops, we could do it in one line, but let's just keep it like this for readability. But anyways, I just think that makes a ton of sense. I'm wondering why we don't have a shorthand for vmodel, but maybe, again, that's the whole two-way binding thing, where it's like, they give you the power of two-way binding just to sort of, because sometimes it's actually very useful to pragmatically solve a problem, like, just immediately and then move on, because you know you're keeping the problems of that two-way binding very isolated within a particular component, let's say. But it's a bit shaky, right? So maybe they want to really avoid encouraging you to use two-way binding, and hence maybe there is no shorthand for vmodel. But what do I know, right? I mean, I'm totally speculating now. But let's say, do we have anything about shorthand here in the... Yep, okay, super cool. Even in the API reference, we have some shorthand statements. So if I search for shorthand, you can see that von, the directive, has a shorthand of at. Then if I keep on searching, vbind has a shorthand of colon. And let's see if we find something else. No. And then we just cycle around and we get to von. So those are the only shorthand things, right? So there is no shorthand for vmodel. The reason for that, we don't know, but I would guess it's something along the lines of what I said, right? Or maybe even if it's not like the political argument that I was making, maybe it's simply just that vmodel probably not going to be used as much as von and vbind. So let's just not create a shorthand for that. Or maybe they ran out of symbols. I don't know. Anyways. Thanks a ton for watching. The next section will be on computed properties and watchers, so be sure to subscribe so that you won't miss that episode. Thanks a ton for watching, and I'm glad to have you along on this journey, and I will see you in the next video.